That's because another multinational wants to get control of our sugar. And they were there. So I asked him 4 questions. He was a nice bloke. He didn't know it. He didn't know it. And have I got to go?
It's getting cold, yeah.
I've been told by experts. And I asked him 4 questions and he didn't know them, but the public started, and I asked him not to say anything to him because he had the guts to turn up, but your local member didn't. Now, that didn't help Australia free trade arrangements with America. Well, there's a fella in Australia who makes tart and stuff, and Taiwan loves it, and he's exporting it to Taiwan. This is just one little thing. They've copied it and sent it out here. His tariff over there is 120%. When they come out here to invade his business, 20%. So there's just one little thing. So if these multinationals that are buying our country up, they'll never pay tax because the parent company owns a joint over there and their subsidiary companies here. So they'll be indebted, so it'll be paid at the plate, so there'll be no income tax paid on the transaction because there's no money changing hands. But the Australian farmer, then he won't be able to compete. It's like when they bought Cubby Station. A classical example, if it costs $100 a bale to make your ends meet in cotton to export it, and they bought Cubby Station, and then and they can produce it for 80, what chance has the Australian cotton farmer got? And that's what these treaties have done. The taxation treaty which I talk about, Malcolm West, I have a lot to do with him. He writes in the Herald. I've got some of his cuttings here. We've signed 44 now. They've just found out we've signed 44. So there's 44 countries not going to pay a zack of tax. And then they said, we want to tax this and we're going to tax that. And as Karl Marx said, taxation is a political tool to suppress and control a country. And Winston Churchill said, you'll never tax a country into prosperity. I'll have to go because they've given me the wind up.
Lunch is getting cold.
Our next speaker probably doesn't really require any introduction, but we'll do it anyhow. Professor Keith Windschuttle, another historian by training. As most of us know, he was the former editor of Quadrant, but as far as I know, he still has the old hand there, or sort of writing hand in Quadrant. Believe it or not, Keith used to be a socialist many years ago, but he just grew out of that.
As we do.
As most normal people do. The old saying, if you're 18 and not voting socialist, you haven't got a heart. If you're 30 and still voting socialist, you haven't got a brain. So Keith is going to be talking on the real goals of Aboriginal constitutional recognition. So without further ado, let's introduce Professor Keith Windschuttle.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for the invitation to speak here, which is the first time I've been to this organisation. Now, what I want to do today is to talk about the real goals of constitutional recognition, as Jim said. But I want to talk about I want to put that issue in a context of the wider context of international law and human rights treaties, which are playing an important but largely unknown role in deciding the outcome of Australia's constitutional referendum, or proposed referendum for next year. And I want to talk first of all, just to put this in a bit more context, about human rights and the refugee crisis and the people smuggling business. Now, in 2014, in Australian waters close to Indonesia, many of you will remember that the Australian Navy intercepted a boatload of 157 people from Sri Lanka. They had hoped to gain entry as refugees, but were told that their only prospects under the Howard government's Pacific Island solution was to have their status processed on either Nauru or Manus Island. And if they were accepted as genuine refugees, they would be settled there in those islands, but not in Australia. Otherwise, they could return to Sri Lanka, which most of them decided they would rather do. Now, it's very clear today that the Howard government's Pacific Island solution to the people smuggling business was an unequivocal expression of the will of the majority of the Australian people. Australian culture still retains a strong streak of egalitarianism, and if there is one category of people of whom egalitarians disapprove, it is queue jumpers. Opinion polls confirm this, especially among existing immigrants who gained entry by more conventional legal means. And popular sentiment is also patriotic and strongly endorses the principle that governments have a duty to preserve national borders. However, our legal, intellectual and artistic communities who had excoriated Howard and his ministers refused to concede any ground despite this evidence from the Sri Lankans that they were not real. And when news broke of the Navy's interception of their boat, we had a bevy of university professors who bombarded the press and television with protests. And a group of 53 legal academics from 17 universities, mostly from legal departments, published a newspaper petition declaring the whole operation against the Sri Lankans illegal because it had ran foul of the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, it's true that under this covenant, Australia is obliged not to deport a person to his home country if he might be subject to persecution there. But a person who genuinely feared persecution would have accepted refuge on Nauru or Manus Island, which none of the Sri Lankans did, thereby confirming that Australian actions, however unwelcome to refugees and legal professors who backed them, were nonetheless perfectly legal. Now, as well as demonstrating the greater commitment these academics have to international laws and agreements than to the democratic processes and sentiments of their own country, their petition was also revealing about how their numbers have grown. The list is packed with the names of institutions that are now housed by our public universities. Most of them are new, and all of them largely replicate one another. Titles include the Centre for International Law, the Centre for Human Rights Law, the Australian Human Rights Centre, the Research Program in International Refugee Law, the Institute for International Law and the Humanities, and so on and so on. Now, these academic institutions are turning out graduates literally in their thousands each year. It's a couple of thousand each year alone, in Australia alone. And you might think that they are grossly oversupplying the labour market. However, in his illuminating book, Sovereignty or Submission, published in 2011, John Fonte, an American academic, argues that international law is one of the leading growth industries of our era. Its practitioners are among the foremost intellectual theorists of an ever-expanding international and transnational law that is not only promoting the growth of international human rights and other treaties, but is also responsible for overturning many long-held assumptions within national legal traditions. Fonte cites law professor Peter Spiro, who argues that judges are building a global community of courts, in part because of networking on foreign and international tribunals. Spiro predicts that the American Constitution is likely to be increasingly globalised by judgments that favourably cite international sources and precedents. Fonte argues that what is emerging is a supranational legal regime. It's a de facto constitutional authority that sits above national constitutions and is enforced mostly by compliant national judges. The citizens of nation states find themselves governed by regulatory institutions unaccountable to them, and which in many cases they do not even know existed. Government policy is being decided less by open debate in the national media and more in the comparatively closed world of legal judgments, learned journals, international conferences and academic seminars. The origins of this supranational legal structure lie not in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which then rightly defended the freedom of the individual. Instead, it derives from the minority group politics or interest group politics of the 1960s and 1970s, especially the feminist movement, which did more than any other to persuade national governments that special bureaucratic institutions and non-government agencies needed to be established to investigate and discourage discrimination against women. In Australia, the anti-discrimination and equal opportunity organisations that emerged at the time became quasi and in some cases explicit commissions for human rights. And the people who run these organisations have built their careers and their mindset not on universal human rights, but on interest group rights, or more accurately, interest group interests. Today, Australia has no less than 9 separate human rights commissions. Yes, 9. 1 in each of the 6 states, 2 in each of the territories, and the national body. Now, they all share a very similar structure that commits them all firmly to interest group politics. And let me just give you the example of the national body, which has 6 commissioners devoted to specific political groups. There's a Disability Discrimination Commissioner, a Race Discrimination Commissioner, a Sex Discrimination Commissioner, a National Children's Commissioner, an Age Discrimination Commissioner, and an Aboriginal Social Justice Commissioner. Now, this is obviously anti-discrimination overkill.
Yeah, right.
The notion that Australian discrimination in any of these areas is sufficient to warrant a dedicated commissioner plus an expensive entourage of bureaucrats and consultants is absurd. In the national capital, Canberra, the population is the best educated, best paid, healthiest and most environmentally conscious in the country. Some of us say that Canberra is the cycling and recycling capital of Australia. Yet to investigate and regulate the total of just 370,000 people in its domain, the Australian Capital Territory Human Rights Commission employs 3 commissioners and a staff of 20. Now, this would all be a joke and an obvious candidate for a television comedy series if its consequences were not so far-reaching. The most dramatic outcome was the Mabo judgment of 1992, when the High Court of Australia reversed more than 150 years of previous court deliberations to find that native title, or Aboriginal ownership of land, was part of the common law of Australia. In a joint judgment, 2 of the judges quite explicitly sought to make Australian law conform to what it saw as international standards, and I'll quote them. The opening up of international remedies to individuals pursuant to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights brings to bear on the common law the powerful influences of the Covenant and the international standards it imports. International law is a legitimate and important influence on the development of the common law, especially when international law declares the existence of universal human rights. Unquote. Now, the High Court's discovery of native title was not a matter of universal human rights at all. It was about the entitlements of a particular ethnic minority group, currently numbering about 670,000 people, or 3% of the Australian population, and the most favoured clientele, as I'm sure you're all aware, of the Human Rights Commission. Nonetheless, universal human rights became the language of the Labor Party government when it introduced a statute to confirm the court's finding in the Mabo case and to create tribunals to hand out land to Aboriginal claimants. As of June 30, 2015, the National Native Title Tribunal has allocated to about 200,000 Aborigines in remote Australia no less than 31.4% of the land of the Australian continent. That's an area bigger than Western Europe, for 200,000 people. For the previous century, much of this land had been leased by white pastoralists to graze cattle, but the new Aboriginal owners showed little interest in continuing the business. Instead, they preferred to remain in the towns and live off unemployment benefits and disability pensions. In some cases, however, the land had valuable mineral deposits, and mining companies now pay huge sums to native title holders to gain access to them, even though in law the Crown still holds rights to all minerals, and the only body a miner legally needs to apply to is the relevant state government. Those who originally justified native title publicly did so in terms of human rights, sacred sites, and the centrality of land to Aboriginal culture. The reality, however, was that native title quickly degenerated into an additional de facto licensing regime run by the native title owners. Faced with the prospect of years of expensive and unpredictable litigation, mining developers succumbed to their demands to pay under-the-counter go-away money. And some Aborigines have been so successful in extracting go-away money that one of their leaders, Warren Mundine, recently predicted that the BRW rich list would soon contain their names.
Yes, we know.
In economics, this phenomenon is known as rent seeking.
That's right.
Instead of creating new wealth, its perpetrators aim to manipulate the political and social environment to gain a privileged position through government legislation or regulation, thereby enabling them to transfer wealth made by others to themselves. And the effect on Australia's principal export industry, the mining industry, has been dire. In the state of Western Australia alone, one survey found almost 2,500 mining projects were being held up by native title claimants. Now, buoyed by their success over the past 2 decades, the Aboriginal leadership, and that is a small class of legally educated, urban-dwelling political activists, want to go one step further and not only get their land back, but get their country back too. They claim the law is now on their side. They argue that because Aborigines never ceded sovereignty in the colonial era, that is, they signed no treaty and were never actually conquered, as the first landowners, they remained the sovereign people. In restoring land rights, Australian courts have recognised that traditional Aboriginal society was governed by its own laws. And the existence of this legal system, so argue Aboriginal activists, logically entails the existence of Aboriginal sovereignty, which they claim was never extinguished by the British Crown's own declaration of sovereignty in 1770 when Captain Cook did it. Now, the Aboriginal political class now believe that the Australian government's acceptance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was accepted by the Rudd government in 2008, gives them this opportunity, that is, to get the country back. When the declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007, it recorded 143 votes in favour, 11 abstentions and 4 against. The last 4 votes were cast by Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States. Now, the Howard government was in office at the time, and its representative in the UN said the declaration, that is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, posed a threat to the territorial integrity of the Australian state. And I'll quote what our representative in the UN said in 2007. Australia supports and encourages the full engagement of Indigenous people in the democratic decision-making process, but does not support a concept that could be construed as encouraging action that would impair, even in part, the territorial and political integrity of a state with a system of democratic representative government, i.e. Australia. In other words, what the Howard government was worried about was that the declaration would open the way for a possible secessionist movement in Australia that aimed to establish the Aborigines as a politically separate people, sovereign in their own right, who are entitled to a state of their own, either within the existing Commonwealth, that is as a 7th state alongside the existing 6th, or outside the existing Commonwealth. And the declaration itself, that the UN declaration, makes it clear that secession is in fact one logical conclusion. It's a possibility within it. And Article 3 says, Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and they freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. In other words, there's no holds barred under this agreement, the international agreement that we have signed, that secession would be, if it went to a court case, would in fact be a legal right of Aborigines under the universal rights of Indigenous people. Now, the declaration was strongly influenced by input from Australian Aboriginal activists. In fact, one of its main authors was Mick Dodson, who I'm sure you've all seen around the place. And for several years, when the ATSIC organisation, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, was in operation before the Howard government closed it down, it maintained a permanent office in Geneva at public taxpayer expense, where they lobbied members of the UN Human Rights Council and provided direct input into the declaration. And in recent years, they've made a lot of headway. As I said, the The Rudd government gave formal support to the declaration. It was actually in 2009, not 2008. And in February 2013, the then Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, passed a bill mandating a constitutional referendum to be held by mid-2017, recognising Aboriginal people in the Constitution. Now, in the existing Constitution that we have, no particular group is identified, just the people. But the proposal that we're being asked to vote on singles out one group of people for special mention, but no one else. Now, in Australia, as I'm sure you're mostly aware, constitutional referendums normally fail if they do not have the support of both major parties. But in this case, in 2013, opposition leader Tony Abbott was persuaded to support the Labor government. He did so in Parliament, made a speech when Gillard announced this referendum, and when he won the election later in 2013, Abbott confirmed he would support his promise. He said, "Until we acknowledge Aborigines as the first peoples, we will be, quote, an incomplete nation and a torn people," unquote. And he adopted the terminology of the human rights industry, which see the Aborigines as first peoples with unique rights. But in the ensuing debate, Abbott looked about for a wording that would also satisfy his conservative base. And now that he has been deposed and replaced by an avowed Republican with no such concerns and who apparently can do what he likes with the conservative base, it's hard to know what Malcolm Turnbull will in fact propose. But it's more likely to be something closer to the Labor Party than to Abbott's Conservatives. Now, one of the main problems for Conservatives in this debate is that a heavily funded government campaign to try to, it's called educate, but really indoctrinate the electorate about this constitutional change is being dishonest about what is at stake. That's an organisation called Recognise Australia. It campaigns through the media and it's persuaded the major sporting codes to get on side. You watch football matches, there are recognised signs around the picket fences of the football ovals. It says the line it pushes is that constitutional recognition will help social inclusion and therefore deserves our compassion. But Recognise Australia never mentions that the ambitious goal of Aboriginal sovereignty is lurking in the background. Now, so far, this approach has been successful, with polls showing a referendum to change the Constitution will probably succeed. Most people today, most Australians, see constitutional recognition just as a courteous symbolic gesture with no real consequences. But unless they know what is actually at stake, Australia will wake up one morning, just as they did in 1992 with land rights, to find our judiciary has discovered a whole range of previously unimagined Aboriginal rights inherent in our newly revised Constitution. In their discussion among themselves and with governments, Aboriginal activists openly state their goal is recognition of their status as the true sovereign peoples of the country. And this has become an intractable political demand, not only among Aboriginal political activists and white academic supporters, but through the wider Aboriginal community in both urban and remote regions. I can give you a whole stack of evidence for this that I've got on in a book I'm doing on this subject, but let me just quote a 2011 survey by the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, which is an Aboriginal lobby group with deep support in remote communities. It found that no fewer than 88% of its members identified constitutional recognition and sovereignty as the most important issues facing their people, well ahead of both health and education. And one of the reports advising the government about constitutional recognition quotes a submission from an Aboriginal organisation in Central Australia. And this is what the Aboriginal organisation in Central Australia has to say about this. I'll quote, "The Aboriginal people have never surrendered to the European invasion and assert that sovereignty over all of Australia lies with them. The settler state has been illegally set up on Aboriginal land. The settler state has never recognised the prior ownership of the land belonging to that of the the prior ownership of the land belonging to that of the Aboriginal nation. We demand that the colonial settlers who have seized the land recognise this sovereignty and on that basis negotiate their right to be here." Unquote. Now, we don't know yet. Apparently the signal will be flagged in July after the coming federal election. We don't know yet what changes to the Constitution we will be asked to make in the referendum for recognition. But the most likely will be some of the clauses proposed by the so-called expert panel that Julia Gillard appointed in 2011. It was an expert panel, as you might imagine, was stacked with Aboriginal activists. They were in fact a majority of the panel. And they argued, among other things, that we should add 2 new sections to the Constitution. They said we need a new section 51A, and I'll read you what that would say. It says, recognising that the continent and its islands, now known as Australia, were first occupied by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, acknowledging the continued relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with their traditional lands and waters, respecting the continuing cultures, language and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and acknowledging the need to secure the advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And that's what they want to put in section 51A. In section 127A, they want to add, there's a section 127, but they want to add section 127A, an additional one, saying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages are the original Australian languages, a part of our national heritage. So the question obviously to ask is, will the Australian people support changes of this kind? Well, to date, opinion polls suggest they will. In May 2015, the recognised organisation reported the findings of a survey it commissioned from Polity Research, which said if a referendum would be held at the time, 75% of all Australians and 87% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would vote yes. Moreover, a majority of people in a majority of states, which is the crucial threshold for a referendum to pass, intended to vote yes. Even 2/3 of Conservative coalition supporters would vote yes. Of course, with no text available to them at the time, and no mention of those 2 clauses that I read to you then being made public, these are only speculations, but they do indicate which way the wind is blowing. Now, the voting public are likely to see enough merit in the proposed new section 51A, as worded above, to give their support. It calls people with Indigenous ancestry the first inhabitants of this continent, which is an obvious truism, which most Australians would find hard to oppose. It says they have a continuing relationship with their land and waters. Yes, some of them do in remote Australia, and they have already got native title to them. So again, another truism that's likely to be supported. They are also said to have continuing cultures and heritage. Now, while some voters, especially in rural Australia, might respond to this proposition with more cynicism than respect, most urban Australians who never come in contact with Aborigines would see this as a motherhood statement that they would be morally obliged to support. However, in the minds of our High Court judges, these proposals would send quite different signals. The first role of the High Court is to interpret the Constitution, and if people vote to amend the Constitution, it would immediately open up the opportunity for the judges to examine the constitutional consequences of the change just made. In particular, it would sanction adventurism amongst judges who are that way inclined. All of the Commonwealth powers in section 51 are read, quote, subject to this Constitution, unquote, which means that Commonwealth powers need to be read subject to any changes in any other part of the Constitution. Having additional words and creating a new context for the place of Indigenous people in the Constitution clearly invites the High Court to construe different meanings from those words. And the fact that the amendments at this stage look likely to be approved by a significant majority of Australian people would tell them that the national mood has changed in favour of amending laws and policies too, which the Commonwealth Executive would then implement. Now, this would tempt judges to accept the more radical propositions long argued by the Aboriginal political class, that they remain the true proprietors of the soil, and that those of us descended from more recent settlers need to renegotiate our right to be here. and judges who want to combine these sentiments with directives derived from Australia's international obligations under the growing number of United Nations treaties, covenants and declarations of rights, could even find that Australia's occupation of its continent is illegitimate. Now, in fact, there is a current debate amongst legal academics and Australian historians about whether Australian settlement really is legitimate, or whether we are a fake colony, or a community of thieves, as Xavier Herbert, the novelist, called us. And that is a serious debate. It's been going on for a long while in the writings of Herbert Nugget Coombs and the public servant who's now deceased, and Henry Reynolds, who's alive and well. And it's vigorously endorsed by almost all, if not all, Indigenous professors of law at Australian universities. Moreover, a constitutional amendment recognising that Aboriginal people have retained their original languages would have important political implications. Remember I said that they want to add section 127A saying that the Aborigines have got their own languages? Well, that's not just a nice thing to say, you know. Nobody cares if they have their own languages because nobody else speaks it except a handful of grandparents. But there's a big political point behind it. Rather than simply indicating respect for cultural traditions, this clause would provide evidence that the Australian people accept that Aborigines have retained their own tribal identity, because language is... tribes are language groups. The Eora people of Sydney are not that's not their tribal name, that's the name of their language. Well, it's the name of people in their language, sorry. But language defines tribal identity. And so to recognise Aboriginal languages means that it would be an important indicator to a High Court case, and more particularly to an international court, that Aborigines have not assimilated into Australian society. It would define Aborigines as bearers of a culture that is distinct from English-speaking Australians, and so further the segregationist agenda. It would also provide a legal basis for separate Aboriginal nations to be defined by language groups rather than the narrow ties of kinship and land occupation that are recognised under native title today. In other words, if a constitutional amendment of this kind was passed, the political demands of the Aboriginal political class are very likely to be met in substance. The High Court could decide that the Constitution should be reinterpreted anew. Once they passed an amendment of the kind proposed, the Australian people would have little or no say in the establishment of a sovereign Aboriginal state. As I said before, either in addition to one of the 6 states, which was Nugget Coombs' preferred version, or in its secession, which is what Michael Mansell and several other radicals from the 1960s who are still alive, that's their preferred solution. But the Australian people would have no say in the establishment of an Aboriginal state. It would be decided in the High Court. And any compensation due to it, because we occupy their land, we have to pay them compensation for 200 years of having stolen it. That would be decided. That could be decided in the High Court, or it could be decided by international law. Even the more cautious members of the High Court bench could be emboldened to join this process if they had a constitutional amendment that demonstrated beyond doubt that the values of the Australian people had changed. Now, I think it goes without saying that none of these proposals would benefit the great majority of Aboriginal people in Australia. 80% of them now live in the suburbs of our major cities, especially Sydney and Brisbane, and the suburbs of our major country towns like Wagga and Dubbo. 20% of them live in remote communities in what a dear friend of mine, Helen...
Helen Cross.
Oh dear, I'm at that age. I'm at that age.
Helen of Troy.
Anyway, she called her book Lands of Shame. Lands of Shame. It's a book about Northern Territory, and the appalling level of domestic violence and child sexual abuse and youth suicide that occur there. The beneficiaries, of course, would be the leaders of the Aboriginal political class, a small group of urban activists, urban educated, urban living, tertiary educated people who would sit on top of the new state in all their splendour. And look, given that we're still in the era, in an anti-imperialist era, I mean, when I was on the left, I was a fervent anti-imperialist in the 1960s and 70s, and the anti-imperialist sentiment is still around in some parts of the world. But you can see that if we had a seventh state within the Commonwealth, it would immediately create a political faction that wanted to secede and have their own country, which they would lead.
Yeah.
Helen Hughes, thank you. God, how can I do that? That's terrible. Anyway, Helen's book is, if you get the opportunity, it's not a happy read, but it's very well written, and the evidence is beyond debate. Now, if you're thinking about the reality of Aboriginal people, most of those in the cities live pretty much like the rest of us. They're not. There's an Aboriginal middle class now, mainly those who go to university and get government jobs. But most Aborigines who live in the cities and larger country towns live a life pretty much the same as the rest of us, and have assimilated into Australian values. And in many cases, unless they say I'm an Aborigine or wear a T-shirt or something, you would never know. But the remote communities are the place where all this, the moral justification for these changes come from, because people say that there's a huge gap in life expectancy. Well, that's almost all entirely from the remote communities, alcoholism, drug addiction, and inability to care for themselves, give themselves proper health care, but the idea that good policy for a depressed group like those in the remote communities could be developed in Geneva and New York by abstract principles of human rights is just rubbish. That's not where you solve these problems. The moral outrage about the condition of Aborigines in remote Australia is solvable. Well, if it's at all solvable, it's only solvable by careful attention to what's going on at the ground level. And as the Howard government's intervention in 2007 found, one of the ways you solve the problem is by locking up all the child pedophiles in those in those Aboriginal communities, putting them in jail for a decade or so, which in fact happened. But the problem for some of the remote communities is that those people are now being released back into the same communities. So the principles that have been developed by international lawyers are useless today in ameliorating the real problems of Aboriginal people. Now, the only bright spot I see in this whole story is that because the authors of the Australian Constitution in the 1890s were wise men and were democrats, they inscribed democratic principles into the document. And constitutional change can only be made in Australia by referendum with the support of the majority of voters in a majority of states. And between now and mid-2017, when this referendum is due to be held, we will see whose view prevails. Thank you.
Okay, Nick.
Hi, I am Nick, and I have been here for 8 years in the country. When you say Aboriginals, does that mean those people that look very brown? How can you not distinguish them from everybody else?
Because look, since the late 19th century, in the southern states of Australia, Aborigines became of mixed descent, and if you have two groups of people living together, sooner or later they intermarry, unless they have a big religious ban on that. But Aborigines never had that, and white people never had any problem about mixing with Aborigines. In the cities, half half the Aborigines marry white people. Both men and women, Aborigines marry white people, and it's that's been going on for such a long time. And there are a lot of Aboriginal people who, a lot of people suspect they are not, but they're on the gravy train, and in order to get the benefits. I mean, there's a lot of benefits you get from being an Aborigine. You get good business loans. You get your children get educated at much greater expense than anyone else. But anyway, I don't want to get that argument is beside the point. But there are a lot of Aboriginal people who you really wouldn't know unless they tell you that they're Aborigines, because their great grandmother was an Aboriginal woman, you know. And there's one guy at the University of Tasmania who got a job reserved for Aboriginal people. He said that he's 164th Aboriginal. And he was interviewed by a guy for a book about Tasmania, and the author said, well, what about the other 63, 64s? Yeah. He said, they're all mongrel. I mean, how racist can you get?
Ross?
In 1967, I voted no in the Nexus thing about making Aboriginals part of a society. This referendum coming up, do you see that as a copy of that again? Nexus.
No. This is the one that's coming up is far more profound. The one that like when the Constitution was written, Aboriginal affairs were left to state governments. The Commonwealth didn't want to get involved. The Commonwealth didn't have a bureaucracy that could handle Aboriginal affairs or pass. And so, in fact, the Commonwealth was. The original Constitution in 1901 said the Commonwealth cannot do anything, pass any laws about Aborigines. Now, by the time the 1950s and 1960s came around and the Commonwealth government was doing social policy around Australia for disabled people, people in old age, and then but the Aborigines were left out, and of Commonwealth funding. And so the main thing of the 1967 referendum was to take out that little clause saying the Commonwealth cannot pass laws for Aboriginal people, and thereby allow the Commonwealth to do it. And since then, of course, the Commonwealth bureaucracy has grown enormously, and they've created native title and all the rest. Yeah.
Well, I'll be voting no again.
Can we just take two more questions?
My question's for Nick. Nick, I'm Aboriginal. My father is a dark man. In fact, John over there knows my dad, and I'm white. Okay?
All right.
So that's different. And I remember the days when my father couldn't go into a shop and be served because he was a black man.
Oh, really?
And I used to have to go in for the family and shop. Okay?
And I think the 1967 referendum put paid to all that. You know, the Commonwealth could pass race discrimination laws, and in fact, we had there were actually race discrimination laws not proclaimed like the Whitlam one was in 1975. That's before right. That, no, I think that was a good thing. And
we don't get free education. We don't. Whatever I want, I pay for, and I'm not on the books for anything. And I don't like being labelled this or labelled that in any society.
I get labelled as a racist, denier, sexist, misogynist,
Islamophobe. That's me.
That's why I'm so sure if I didn't have all those labels, I'd be like 6 foot tall.
I'm 6 foot tall.
Last question, Jim Salim.
Yeah, just a technical one. You've promised a volume 2, I understand, for your... is that likely to appear soon?
Yeah, look, I'm currently writing 2 books. I'm writing a book on this constitutional referendum, and I'm in the straight of the race to finish that. But the question I mentioned in this thing here about the legitimacy of Australia as a colony, which Henry Reynolds has produced 2 books now saying Australia, like the law of the land and Aboriginal sovereignty, saying Australia is an illegitimate country. Now, my original volume in Tasmania was about was it warfare or not? Was there a war between the Aborigines and the settlers? And I said no, it's too small and too insignificant to warrant the title of warfare. And there are other reasons why the Aborigines had conflicts, but and rather than repeat that in Eastern Australia, which was my original intention for Volume 2. Volume 2 is now starting with a very long chapter on the legitimacy of Australian settlement, which I think is an issue that's got to be addressed. And because no one, I mean, the academic legal profession all say it's either it's up in the air or it's definitely illegitimate. Now these people are. I mean, if you read Robert French, the current Chief Justice, he believes all this stuff. He really believes it. And if we get another Labor government after this July election, they will stack the High Court. I mean, in Australia, well, look, both sides stack the High Court with their own appointees, and if it balances out, it should balance out. The trouble is, the Conservatives is they only stack half their appointments with their own people, and then they give a couple of, politically, they give a couple of people, token immigrants, and I mean in the USA they've now got Chicanos or Latin Americans and blacks and all this, and so Australia will go down that route. If we get a Labor government, they will appoint interest group representatives to the High Court. But the Conservatives, they put a few Conservatives in, but they put these other people in as well. So it's a losing game in stacking the High Court, as far as I can see.
Yeah, a quick one there, Drew.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, Frank Salter in Quadrant
Yep.
wrote an article about the recognition issue, and I guess he was suggesting that if this gets up, that there's a case to be made for recognizing Anglo-Australians as a constituent.
Well, not only Anglo-Australians. You know who got here before the Anglo-Australians?
Vikings.
Not the Vikings. Worse than the Vikings.
The Japs.
Oh, the Thetans!
No, they
Sleep, obviously.
came from the city. They came from the city of Makassar in the Celebes of now Indonesia, and they only eat meat that's been killed while the animal's still alive.
It's pretty hard to argue that they are responsible for creating the Australian nation.
Well, that's absolutely true. But if you read Robert French, the Chief Justice, and as they say, the Aborigines had a role in creating creating the Australian nation. And I read this and I say, no, the continent, not the nation, but all of their phrases and clauses that are contenders for being inserted in the Constitution say the Australian nation. Nugget Coombs started all this when he said there's three layers of Australian history. There's the Aboriginal one, then there's the British one, and then there's the multiculti one that's come in here since the Second World War. And so we have three different populations. Now, that's in the nation. That's the history of the continent, not the history of the nation. The nation is English. It's not even based on Scottish law, it's based on English law. And it's based on the Westminster Parliament in London. And plus some input from the Americans in terms of the Senate and things. It's an Anglo, it's a WASP constitution, and the Aborigines there's not a word in the Constitution or even a concept that comes from the Aborigines or from post-war immigrants. The post-war immigrants, who, in my view, are very welcome. They marry into our society and everything else. It's gone swimmingly well. But they did not contribute to the nation. The nation was already formed, shaped, and it was an existing nation that attracted people after World War II to come here.
We should have hung out.
So the Anglos have had a bad press for a long time, especially in academia, but also in the law.
We're the ones being
Should they be
discriminated against.
recognised in the Constitution?
I think the way it is now is perfect. We, the people.
We're the ones being discriminated against.
Yeah, that's all you need. Those of us who are citizens or become citizens, we are the ones who decide what happens here. If you mess with it any other way, you really seriously undermine democratic principles of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dr. Tim Anderson. He's an academic at Sydney University, and let's all welcome Dr. Tim Anderson.
Good afternoon, friends. Very happy to be in this beautiful Blue Mountains on a Sunday afternoon. I want to start by saying this is a story. Can we go back one? This is a story about the conflict in Syria, which has been going on for more than 5 years now. A very long war. Most wars don't last this long. And what attracted my attention to it at first, because I have to admit, 5 years ago I didn't have any particular special knowledge about Syria. I had to read up on it when it was beginning, was that it was inexplicable to me how the violence began there, according to what the media was telling us at that time. If you have been following the media, and I've stopped following the media, the newspapers and the television, I mean, I'm on the internet every day, and on the internet you have enormous amount of choices to the sources of information you get. But if you believe that story, there were these political demonstrations that turned violent, basically, and wanted to oust the government. That didn't satisfy me, and of course we'd seen a similar sort of process with the conflict in Libya just a couple of months earlier. And so that's what led me to investigating that, and eventually, at the beginning of this year, publishing this book. I've got some copies here. Mainly because of the disinformation war that was going on, and it was very frustrating to me, the quality of information that the media was putting out. Now, Syria generally, you may know to some degree or another, is sort of a crossroads country, basically. On the one hand, it's got an ancient civilization. If you go to Damascus today, and I've been there 3 times in the last 3 years, it's got the history in millennia, you know, written in stone, this history that goes back. It's said to be around 10,000 years old, the civilization. You've got Roman Temple of Jupiter and this very old mosque there that has Christian and all sorts of elements in it. It's a pluralistic sort of place, Syria, because of the fact that it's been in those sort of crossroads. The majority of people there are Muslim, mainstream Muslim, but you've also got a lot of minorities. You've got 2 million Christians, 2 million Alawis who are more westernised sort of Muslims, basically. You've got Druze people, Assyrians, Armenian Christians, a whole range of people who over a long period of time migrated to the area and liked the idea of a pluralistic country where people could get on without having a religious state, for example, which had existed in other parts and still exist in the Gulf monarchies to this day. So, of course, the colonial period came around, and the Ottomans the Ottoman Empire was dismantled after the First World War. The British and the French went in. They started dividing things up. You know, they created a state for Israel. They divided that up, pushed the Palestinians out. Lebanon was carved out of Syria. All of those sorts of things happened in that period. But that's not so in other words, the modern states that exist there today are relatively new, but the cultures and the civilizations there are very, very old, and people are aware of that, basically. They're aware of, Syrians, for example, are very aware of the fact that their culture is older than Christianity and older than Islam. And they like that fact too. But what's distinct about Syria in contemporary political terms is that it hasn't been a base for US military presence. They've helped support the Palestinians in their resistance against Israel there. And they haven't been integrated into this broader project that the US has had in the region, which has been called in recent times the New Middle East. Now, the New Middle East is something that was spoken about back at the time of 2001, when the first major intervention in recent times in the Middle East took place. I say recent times because there'd been CIA infiltration to Syria in the 40s and the 50s and so on. But if we look at the recent wars, that's all in our living memory now, unless you're under 20 or something. There was Afghanistan. And the misinformation's been associated with all of these sorts of wars. Now, you remember after the invasion of Afghanistan, supposedly to arrest some suspects for the terrorist crime in New York in 2001, they forgot about Osama bin Laden. They forgot about him for 10 years. Indeed, it was almost like an afterthought that they claimed to have captured him, killed him and dumped his body in the ocean, so there was no evidence of it, basically. But the President Bush at the time said that it wasn't a priority, Osama bin Laden, after they'd gone into Afghanistan, after they'd effectively thought they had controlled that country. You remember with the Iraq War that there was a claim that the government of Saddam Hussein was going to attack Britain or the US within 45 minutes, and once they'd destroyed that country and caused incredible damage and slaughter, they said, oh, well, it seems like there weren't any weapons of mass destruction there. So long as the misinformation was useful, it was maintained. When it wasn't useful, it went away. Libya. Can you see a pattern here? Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, if it wasn't too difficult, would be on the agenda also.
It's on the hit list.
Yeah.
With Libya, the claims they were making about President Gaddafi were of a similar nature to the ones they make about President Assad in Syria, that he was a dictator, killing his own people and so on, and there had to be intervention for humanitarian reasons to save the Libyan people from the Libyan government. The same thing with Syria. Well, now, there's quite a good article written in Foreign Affairs, which is a Washington linked, a foreign policy linked journal of the Centre for Foreign Relations, just last year, which said, based on a lot of independent evidence, that all of the claims about Gaddafi were false. He wasn't getting his army to rape women, he wasn't hiring mercenaries to kill people, he wasn't massacring civilians. All of that stuff was rubbish. How could they admit that in the centre of, the intellectual centre of the process in the US? Because it didn't matter to them anymore. Libya was destroyed. Libya is a mess. It doesn't have effective government. Al-Qaeda groups are a large part of the power there. But with Syria it still matters because they haven't prevailed in the Syrian situation. They didn't manage to ride over the state as they did in Afghanistan, as they did in Iraq, as they did in Libya. Those countries, for all good, bad and ugly reasons, had their own systems. But in Syria, and they were always a bit, the US government was always nervous about Syria because in the past they were linked to the Soviet Union. In the past they had the Soviet Union as allies. These days Russia, which is a different beast, but there's still a continuity with that process. They had a stronger army, they were allied to Iran. And what was objectionable to Israel was that something that they call in the region the axis of resistance, Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, Syria and Iran, were effectively providing arms to the Palestinians to resist Israel. So that was an enormous irritant to Israel and an irritant to Washington. And so really the only countries in the whole region now that don't have US bases there are still Syria and Iran. But what's changed in recent times, I'm fast forwarding a little bit, I'll go back a little bit to this conflict, is that Iraq is now becoming a strong ally of Syria and Iran. Iraq, over which all of that blood was shed to invade that country and get rid of the government of Saddam Hussein, the natural drift would have been because, well, for a number of reasons, but the natural drift would have been that Iraq and Iran would develop good relations. And indeed that began to happen after the government of Saddam Hussein was pushed out of the way effectively there, and the Ba'ath Party was banned in Iraq and so on, when the US still had large-scale troops in the country. What was happening then was that Washington became very alarmed in Iraq, and I'm going to say something about Iraqi now, because to understand what's now spoken of as the big extremist group in the region, ISIS, this begins in Iraq. It begins in Iraq 10 years ago this year. Why? Because the main agent of the US in the region, outside Israel, to help foment division amongst peoples in that region is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia now coming under examination for their role in 9/11 in the US. Now Saudi Arabia is a family business effectively, not really a country. There's no other country. There's no other country that's got named after not even North Korea is called Kim Jong-il. Saudi Arabia is named after one family, even though 20 million people live there. More than 20 million people live there. But they've been the experts. They worked for the British. They worked with Churchill. If you look at Churchill's old writings, he says he was horrified by the Saudi family. He was horrified the way they chopped off people's hands and the way they treated the women, all that sort of stuff. But he would always appreciate their undying loyalty to the British, basically. In other words, the British used them, and the British said back in India, the Roman motto was divide and conquer, and we're going to do that too. The British got a shock back in the mid-19th century when there was what they still call the Sepoy Mutiny and what the Indians call the First War of Independence. And they were determined to divide the Indians so they couldn't be, they wouldn't, if the Indians united against them, they were done. The British knew they were done, basically. So they wanted to divide them. And they brought that message forward to what remained of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, basically. So the Saudis were the ideal candidates for that because they are the ones that developed this extremist ideology, this Wahhabism, which you see now with ISIS, of cutting people's throats, cutting their heads off because they're unbelievers, that sort of stuff. That's not a general philosophy across the Middle East region at all. It's something that developed in the Gulf in context of those particular monarchies in that region, that extremist ideology. And what you see in ISIS today, or Al-Qaeda, is really the roots of it ideologically are in Saudi Arabia, basically. So in the 50s, when Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, you remember the great Arab nationalist leader who defeated the French and the British over the Suez Canal because the US wouldn't back him up.
That's right.
The British and the French thought that the US would back them up. They didn't back them up, and the Egyptian, this was the first time any Middle Eastern government had actually defeated a big power in that sort of way. So, of course, in the Arab world, Nasser was God, basically. Nasser was, you know, everyone wanted to be Arab nationalists to follow in his footsteps there. And Eisenhower, President Eisenhower in the 50s in the US, got the Saudi family out of the hands of the British, because the US was becoming the big power in the world after the Second World War. The British were in decline in terms of their power. And Eisenhower spoke of lifting up the Saudi king as a spiritual leader and a political leader in the region. But really it was a competition. He wanted a competing pole of power to the Arab nationalists who were putting together Ba'ath parties in Iraq, Ba'ath parties in Syria. Basically one-party systems which were focused on Arab nationalism and independence, and various degrees of socialism and minimal degrees of religious rule, basically. It's not that when they talked about secular governments there, they weren't talking about completely non-religious systems, but that Islam or any other religion was not going to be running the state, basically. It was going to be part of their heritage and their traditions and values and stuff, but not a religious state. So all of Arab nationalism was against this idea of a religious state. Well, that's what developed in Syria too. And still to this day, Syria is really the only really pluralist system country in the region, basically. The Gulf states, they call them Sunni states these days, really they're monarchies which have extremist versions of religion. Israel, of course, is a religious type of state that's involved in its own ethnic cleansing. But Syria and Lebanon has a sectarian constitution where everyone has to identify with their religion or their community, and it's appalling. They've had a garbage crisis there. How have they solved it? Well, here's the Druze garbage, and here's the Sunni garbage, and here's the Christian garbage, and it's appalling. You know, if you go to Damascus today, Damascus is a very clean, well-functioning city, despite the fact the war's been going 5 years. You go to Beirut, and it's terrible. It's a mess, basically. We go to the next one there, thanks. So, you recall that the pretexts for war with Iraq were proven to be false. Once they were no longer useful, it didn't matter. It really didn't matter. We'll go to the next one, thanks. Back one, thanks. Sorry, we're zipping forwards, but can you go back to number... back. So, skip ahead a little bit there. There we go. How this conflict started. When the media reports in March 2011 said that a bunch of protesters came out wanting reform. That's true. There was a political reform movement on the streets there. And then some of the people were arrested. That's true. And, you know, buildings were burnt and so on. But then in the middle of that, what happened was snipers on the roofs started shooting at police and civilians and doctors picking up the wounded people. And I remember looking at this and thinking, where does that come from? You know, political protests don't usually start sniping at police and sniping at civilians and doctors and so on. And this was blamed on the government. You know, the government was shooting police, the government was shooting doctors, civilians. What's going on here? To cut a long story short, and I spell it out in this book, what was going on there at the time was a genuine political protest movement, or reform movement, let's say, which was going on and still is there to a certain degree, but something came in alongside it, and that was an Islamist insurrection. I say Islamist in the sense of it wasn't really so much to do with Islam, it was to do with this type of Wahhabist movement. Basically, there were extremist groups embedded in a regional network called the Muslim Brotherhood there. The Muslim Brotherhood started in Egypt, came to Syria, backed by some of the Gulf states. There was some competition between different groups there, but basically it was an extremist group that had tried insurrections in the past and they'd been crushed in the past. There was a very similar one in Dara 30 years earlier in Syria. It was crushed within a month. A few thousand people were killed, but basically they started trying to incite a sectarian division, a sectarian war in Syria. That failed. The same sort of thing started in Dara. We know now, because there have been admissions, that the Saudis armed it. They sent in arms from across from Jordan through Iraq to the Al-Amari Mosque in Dara and started that there. Now, the problem here is that the Western media began an entirely different story. And if you go to most of the Western agencies, including NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, well, Amnesty was created in London actually as an independent sort of group and has become closer and closer to the White House. Human Rights Watch was created in the foreign policy elite in the US. It used to be called Helsinki Watch, and it was aiming to put a human rights critical focus on the Soviet Union back in the late 70s. Helsinki Watch, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, became Human Rights Watch and is used to focus on the targets of the White House. Now, the line from Human Rights Watch and the Obama administration has been exactly the same, that there was a peaceful protest movement which went on for 6 months. It was repressed so much and there was so much government violence against these protesters, eventually they took up arms. But it wasn't violent for the first 6 months. That's more or less the line that's still in vogue in the Western media. But there were independent witnesses like this Jesuit priest who lived in Homs for 40 years and was murdered by one of the extremist groups 2 years ago, Father France. And he says, no, there were people within that movement there were violent people who were taking cover under that protest movement. It was a different